Most of you know, I wrote a book called The Truth About COVID-19. Best-selling book I've ever written. Really helped expose the fraud of this pandemic. But now there's a new book, The Real Anthony Fauci, written by Bobby Kennedy. You will not believe the depth that this goes in to with respect to identifying and the corruption and the fraud and the deception that's been going on for 50 years. The fact that he funded more than, or was responsible for distributing more than $1 trillion of taxpayer funding over those 50 years, and essentially created this cabal with the pharmaceutical companies. And he really is the major catalyst for it. And this is an 100% unbelievable must-read book that you need to get. And to convince you of that, you're going to see highlights of what's in the book in the next hour that I discuss it with Bobby Kennedy. And must read. And it's highly likely, this is kind of the key point, that once this book is published, very shortly, and especially when the Republicans take over some of the House and such, the investigations are going to show, and he's likely going to resign in the not too distant future, largely as a result of what's exposed in this book. So you're definitely going to want to pick up the book and watch this interview.
I have a picture that somebody got from a Freedom of Information request, and it is a March Madness graph of all of the pandemics that he had, fake pandemics he's tried during his career, all converging with the grand winner being coronavirus. And he signed it, somebody on his staff made it.
Oh,
but it's Tony Fauci's triumph winning March Madness, and it's basically a picture of his career, him trying every 3 or 4 years a new fake pandemic and finally hitting on all 8 cylinders with coronavirus. And, you know, it's like, it's a joke. And, you know, we are the punchline. Everything in Tony Fauci's career is Groundhog Day. Again and again and again, he is repeating the same behavior that is paying off. And he has this way of talking where he never really says anything, and this habit of lying and lying and lying. 70 to 90% of COVID deaths and hospitalizations could have been prevented. And there are hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed studies that support that. And yet, he's saying, you know, he forbids people from doing it. That is a sociopath. And shutting down 1 million businesses, is that really going to save lives? There's no study that indicated it would. We have 4.2% of the global population, and we had 14.5% of the deaths. Mm-hmm. Why is anybody listening to this guy? There's no health minister in the world who has a worse track record than Tony Fauci.
Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Mercola helping take control of your health. And today we are joined by Bobby Kennedy, who really needs no introduction. If you've been following this space, he's been a real activist in promoting environmental issues, but also more recently with the vaccine issue. So we've both been, we're number 1 and number 2 in the misinformation dozen. And we both had the privilege of being censored actually banned from YouTube's platform for not breaking any rule except one they invented the day they banned us. We had no strikes, nothing. Boom, they removed 20 years of my content, and or 15 years, whatever it was, because we were in from the beginning, and also all of Bobby's. So, and I'm just really delighted that Bobby wrote the foreword to my book, which is The Truth About COVID, which did really, really well, thanks to all the discrediting. But Bobby's got a new book coming out, The Real Anthony Fauci, and it is unbelievable. He's spent many, many hours, really dedicated a big portion of his life to doing the investigative journalism and pulling out the details. And this is a book you've got to get. So we're going to talk a little bit about it, but I can assure you with the highest degree of confidence that we could talk for hours and hours and hours and not cover but a fraction of what's in this book. It is a long book, detailed. It's a one that's going to keep your attention and you'll really love and enjoy it. So I would strongly recommend it. But we're going to touch on the highlights because we don't have a lot of time, and we'll do the best we can. So welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks. Most of the time you do interviews with people who have not read the book, but I know we were sending you chapter by chapter as I got it finished, and you were the first one to read it, and you read it all the way through, and it is a very long book. It's got a tremendous, I think 2,000 footnotes in it, 2,000 references, and it is, and it's just got a lot of detail, but it's a very devastating indictment of Tony Fauci and his career in the way that he has essentially made NIH an incubator for pharmaceutical products and sold the soul of our country to the pharmaceutical industry.
I don't know there's any better indictment against Fauci than the book you've written. I'm certainly there's many articles, but a completely comprehensive, detailed reference, incredibly well referenced record of his history of decimating human health, in spite of his charade of being a charlatan as being this ostensible public health do-gooder that's out to save humanity. He's doing the exact opposite. So there's so many places where you can start. I'll let you pick where you want, because we can go into. I mean, and I particularly enjoyed the context you put him in, comparing him to Rockefeller, and putting that all in, because Rockefeller kind of started this over a century ago, and Fauci is picking up where he left off.
Yeah, I mean, what Rockefeller did was he basically this was a time when his oil interests had made him the richest person in world history. He's still the richest person in world history. If you look at his wealth compared to everybody else who lived on the planet at that time, he owned about 80% of the oil production on the planet, and they realized at one point that pharmaceutical products could be synthesized from the byproducts of the refinery process. His father, John D's father, Devil Bill Rockefeller, had been I guess you would call it a medicine show.
Yeah, the true snake oil salesman.
Who actually was selling literally snake oil and, and a lot of opium-based products and alcohol-based products that allowed people to drink, to get drunk, to get high on medicine. And John D. Rockefeller threw himself back into that. He commissioned a man named Andrew Flexner to go across the country and look at all the medical schools. And at that time, about half the medical schools in the country were integrative medicine. They were osteopath schools. They did homeopathy. They did naturopathy. They did a lot of herbs and traditional medicine. It was an American science, and Flexner, and I'm sure there were lots of problems with that kind of medicine. There's Flexners in every kind of medicine, and I'm sure there were there too. But Flexner went across the country and did a report that said that everything should be based on pharmaceutical products, on the kind of products that were being made by Rockefeller's partners. He had huge stakes in pharmaceutical companies, and they transformed they got rid of all of those schools of the chiropractors, osteopaths, naturopaths, homeopaths, and they integrated all medical schools into the pharmaceutical paradigm. He did that at the same time in China. And the Rockefeller name is still very, very big in China. I think he started 12 medical schools or hospitals in China. And it did the same thing, tried to transfer traditional Chinese medicine and to get the Chinese to adopt the pharmaceutical paradigm. And In many ways, as I show in the book, Bill Gates and Tony Fauci are the apogee of that trajectory. And they have, Bill Gates summons Tony Fauci to his Seattle, Washington mansion on the banks of Lake Washington in the year 2000 and brought him into his library for a private meeting and said to him, I want to be partners with you. And their partnership was an agreement to vaccinate the entire population of the world with a battery of new vaccines. And they in 2009, they rebranded their partnership the Decade of the Vaccine. And the objective of that crusade was to have mandatory vaccination for every adult and child on the planet by the year 2020. And I show how they use these pandemic simulations, working with very, very closely with the intelligence agencies, with the social media companies, with the big media companies, and with the major pharmaceutical companies to make that happen. And when Gates calls what he does philanthropic capitalism, it's a way that you can use philanthropy to make money. Oh, he had the foundation that is where he has sheltered, $50 billion in tax-free money. Mm-hmm. And yet he continues to have absolute control over it. And he uses that money to gain controls of the public health agencies in our country, the WHO. He's created a lot of his own, with Dr. Fauci, a lot of these quasi-governmental agencies that people think are governmental, but they're actually just front groups for the pharmaceutical industry, like Gavi and CEPI and Brighton Collaboration. And he uses this battery and this control of WHO to set pharmaceutical or medical policy, public health policy around the globe in a way that maximizes the profits from his stakeholding in these big pharmaceutical companies. I show also in a very minor way, he's simultaneously doing the same thing to control the global food supply. GMO crops and huge investments in Cargill, Monsanto, processed foods like Kraft, McDonald's, Coca-Cola is the biggest investor, and really trying to change both public health and food policies in ways that benefit corporations that he's invested in and that he's partnered with.
Yeah. So thank you for summarizing that. But the book goes into far more detail with respect to the history of Fauci, because he just didn't turn evil when he met Gates. He had a 3-decade history prior to Gates, and you document that quite extensively, especially with the HIV. I mean, this is no mystery. This is essentially a repeat play button that he's done with HIV. What he's doing here, just at a bigger scale. So. Why don't you discuss that? Because if you know that history, it's no surprise.
Yeah, with HIV, he had just taken over the National Institute for Allergic and Infectious Diseases. And at that time, AIDS hit in 1981, first cases surfaced. But all of that, because the first signal of AIDS was Kaposi sarcoma, which was a skin cancer that afflicted gay men. The whole AIDS program went to the National Cancer Institute, a separate institute inside HHS. And when Robert Gallo went in 1983 and Luc Montagnier said, wait a minute, this may be caused by a virus, an HIV virus, because originally everybody believed it was caused by poppers and by the abuse of these psychotropic drugs, of mephedrine, heroin, LSD, and other drugs, but particularly poppers that were part of the gay party scene after Stonewall. And all of the people, the original people who were diagnosed with carpal sarcoma, every one of them was a very, very extensive copper user. So the original assumption was that this was a chemical problem and it had a chemical etiology. And when Luc Montagnier and Robert Gallo said, no, we found this virus in many of the people who have AIDS, I think there were 47% of them. And that was an opportunity for Tony Fauci, because he was able to have a battle with the National Cancer Institute and say, this is a viral disease, therefore it's an infectious disease, and it's under my jurisdiction, my cures. And he was able to win that program away. The same year that billions of dollars began flowing into HIV, and he had to create the agency really from the ground up. And the way that he did it was to partner with Glaxo, who was then the Burroughs Wellcome Company, which made AZT. AZT was a chemotherapy formulation that was so toxic, it killed all the rats when they gave it to them, that the inventor of AZT felt that it was unsafe for any human use, and he didn't even patent it. And very early on, the National Cancer Institute found out that when you put AZT in a culture of HIV, that it killed HIV. Not surprisingly, it killed anything it touched. And so Tony Fauci partnered with Burroughs Wellcome. Literally, he became a partner, and he guided that formulation through the regulatory process, and he got it very, very fast tracked. He cheated terribly on the clinical trials. The clinical trials, it was killing everybody. It literally kills everybody who takes it. But he was able to keep the people in the placebo group, or he was able to keep the people in the treatment group alive by giving them huge numbers of transfusions, of blood transfusions, to just keep them alive for the 8 weeks that that trial continued. And based upon that 8-week trial, he got approval. It was unprecedented of that drug. And as Kerry Mullis, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the PCR test, said, even with any chemotherapy drug, you're supposed to give it to somebody for 2 weeks. And the chemotherapy is designed to kill every cell in your body, but hopefully it kills tumor cells first. And you can take the person off it, the tumor dies, if you time it right, and the person doesn't die. If you put somebody on that for life, like Tony Fauci was doing, every one of them is going to die, and that's what happened. And and meanwhile, there was a lot of drugs at that time that were repurposed medications, like aerosol penadine, many, many others that local community-based doctors in San Francisco and New York who were treating the AIDS community were finding that these drugs treated the symptoms of AIDS, and they stopped people from dying.
Yeah, and the symptom.
Tony Fauci made a deliberate crusade to sabotage those drugs and to make sure they were not available to sick people, in order to make sure that AZT would be the only solution. And AZT was the most expensive drug in history. It was $10,000 for a 1-year dose. And Burroughs Wellcome, which later became GlaxoSmithKline, doubled in size because of that. And Tony Fauci basically created this template that he would then use over the next 45 years to develop drug after drug, these toxic drugs after toxic drugs, to kill repurposed medication, to kill early treatment, to kill any protocol that competed with his pharmaceutical enterprise. And a lot of people have died.
Yeah, well, it's more than a lot. It's 330,000 people dead from AZT alone. That's at least what you wrote in the book. And additionally, the cost of that drug is the analogies or similarities between that scenario and what's happening today are almost identical. The Fauci discouraged the use of the drugs, as you mentioned, specifically ones to treat, not it's a Kaposi sarcoma, but also pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. Where, simple drugs like Bactrim would work really well, but they discouraged it, and they were inexpensive and relatively non-toxic. But similar to the way he's discouraging ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. But the cost, this is the thing that I did, that $10,000 for a treatment for that drug, for AZT, it cost them $5. $5. And my guess is, although I don't recall reading the book, and you may know, is that the research that was paid, that supported the development of that drug, was probably paid for by the U.S. taxpayer.
Yeah, the entire development of that drug was financed through the National Cancer Institute. At one point, the CEO of Glaxo wrote an editorial because people were, the gay community was saying, why is this costing us $10,000 when it's only $5 for them to develop the dose? They're selling it for $10,000. He wrote this very, very self-congratulatory editorial in the New York Times saying, the usual stuff the pharmaceutical industry says to justify these outrageous prices, which is we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars developing these drugs, and it's a crapshoot, and many of them don't work, and it's hard, it's expensive to get approval. Well, the director then of NCI published a letter to the editor saying, wait a minute, here's what the taxpayer paid for, everything. And Burroughs Wellcome did nothing. And not only that, but Burroughs Wellcome would not even test the drug because it was terrified of handling HIV.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it told, the people at HHS, at the government agency, do not send any samples over to us. You do it yourself. So the taxpayer paid for everything, and Burroughs Wellcome, all they did, because of Tony Fauci, all they did was cash in. And they killed a huge number they killed a huge number of people.
Yeah, and he's upped his game. So, a third of a million people, I can do better than that, because he repeated the same damn behavior with the vaccines for the jabs for COVID, which essentially it's the same scenario. That is taxpayer funded research. And I believe the last projections I saw are an estimate of $100 billion in profits from those jabs in 1 year. And this is going to be a semi-annual, every 6-month booster requirement, no liability, zero liability, and pure profit.
Subsidy, of course. That's their biggest subsidy. But and I have another chapter that basically is the same thing. It's all about how everything in Tony Fauci's career is Groundhog Day. Again and again and again, he is repeating the same behavior that is paying off. And he has this avuncular manner and this way of talking where he never really says anything, and this habit of just lying and lying and lying. But people believe him because he people call him Teflon Tony. He can make mistake after mistake, and none of them are ever fatal. And I knew a lot about the inside of what happened during the HIV crisis, because my uncle, Teddy Kennedy, was chair of the health committee at that time. And Teddy was the first presidential candidate to court the gay vote. And so, I was running part of his campaign at that time, and I campaigned in the Castro with Teddy. He was the first presidential candidate ever to go into the Castro and to go bar to bar, shake hands, make speeches, do stuff. Speeches and say and invite the gay community into mainstream American life. And when he and in the health committee, his primary concern for most of the time was AIDS. He recruited the first openly gay chief of staff, Terry Byrne, and the first staff member on Capitol Hill for a decade who was openly had HIV. And he ran it, and they were at constant odds with Tony Fauci, trying to get him to use repurposed medicines. And I talk about this in my book. Finally, Tony Fauci was called in front of Congress and was just filleted. And there's the dialogue of what, Nancy Pelosi was one of the people who, and Henry Waxman, and all of these well-known Democratic congressmen who were saying, "What the hell are you doing? No, you've produced nothing. You're totally incompetent." And and after that, his career was over. And he decided at that point, okay, I'm going to work on getting these repurposed drugs on the market. And he did that for a couple of years. And he had a project, which was a dual track project where they could, without going through the clinical project in FDA, with clinical trials in FDA, randomized placebo-controlled trials, they could get approval for these drugs so that people could get insurance for them and pay for them. And Fauci named that after Terry Byrne, my uncle's aide. So I was sort of deeply involved in this for many, many years. And I've known Tony Fauci for a long time. And I have insights on who he really is that most liberal Democrats are utterly ignorant of. They look at him, they think he's the savior, he's the steady hand during the chaotic Trump administration who is pro-science, and he is the opposite of everything they believe. He is the architect who turned our public health system over to the pharmaceutical industry. When Tony Fauci came to office in 1968, the chronic disease rate in American children was 6%. By 2006, it was 54%. Oh, he does not do public health. And there is no metric at NIH where they look and they say, we are improving public health. The only metric they have is how many vaccines have we given? How many pharmaceutical drugs have we sold? How much patent money are we getting back into the agency? And as I explain in the book, this agency has become an incubator for the pharmaceutical industry.
Mm-hmm.
What Tony Fauci does with that $6.1 billion budget that he gets from the taxpayer, and then another 1.6 from the military to do bioweapons research, which is where most of the 68% of his salary comes from weapons research. And that's why he had to do that gain of function shenanigans in Wuhan. He had to do it because he had to hold on to his salary, and most of his salary comes from the military and from bioweapons research. But the rest of that money, Congress intended him to study American health and to improve it, to try to eliminate infectious allergic diseases, autoimmune diseases. But instead, under his watch, the chronic disease epidemic exploded. And he controls, between him and Gates and Wellcome Trust, which is the UK version of the Gates Foundation. They control, by the way, Wellcome Trust is the stock portfolio for Burroughs Wellcome, the company that made AZT, is now GlaxoSmithKline. And between those three entities, and they all work in tandem, they talk to each other constantly. They're all friends, deep personal confederates or cronies, I would say. They control 63% of the biomedical research on Earth. But the fact is, they really control all of it, because not only do they fund it, but they have the capacity to cut off funding. Mm-hmm. If there's somebody who wants to do what Tony Fauci is supposed to do, listen, and you're in my generation, Joe, the autism rate is 1 in 10,000. You will never meet a 67-year-old man with a football helmet, with diapers, non-toilet trained, non-verbal, head banging, stimming, toe walking, full-blown autism. I've never seen somebody like that, my age.
Right.
And like his generation, 1 in 22 boys looks like that. Why did that happen? When Congress said to the EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic began, EPA said, it's a red line, 1989. Something happened in 1989 that brought us food allergies, peanut allergies. All of your Tourette syndrome, on narcolepsy, tics, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune diseases like juvenile diabetes, all of them went epidemic beginning around 1989. Tony Fauci's job is to say, why did that happen? It has to be an environmental toxin. Genes don't cause epidemics. They may provide the vulnerability, but they cannot cause an epidemic. You need an environmental toxin.
Yeah.
All we have to do is figure out which one started in 89 and became ubiquitous the same year. Tony Fauci, if anybody tries to do that study, their career will be ruined. And we know what it has to be. It has to be either the vaccines, which exploded in 89. And by the way, every one of those 170 chronic diseases that went epidemic beginning in 1989 is listed as a side effect on the manufacturer's inserts of those vaccines. So that's a prime suspect. There's other things that happened. Glyphosate happened and became ubiquitous.
But that was mostly the 90s. That was mostly the 90s. That was mostly the 90s glyphosate.
Yeah, 93 really, it became ubiquitous. It started in 73, though. They got,
small amounts.
Started marketing it, but it was small. It was when it got huge in 93 when they invented Roundup Ready corn. Mm-hmm. And then it got put on everything when they began doing the genetic manipulation. Neonicotinoid pesticides, cell phones.
Well, cell phones really wasn't that wasn't
later too, so it doesn't
the
really.
Smartphone was 2010, but what the key year is 1986 when they passed the Child Adverse Reaction Liability Act that allowed them immunity against prosecution.
Exactly, and that's why in 89 the vaccine schedule exploded, because now it was an gold rush. But there was also, you also have ultrasound, which shared at the same timeline, PFOAs, which are flame retardants. So our kids are swimming around in a toxic soup. Mm-hmm. And it could be all of those things. It could be one or another, but it's easy to find out. You just do science. Right. And that science is easy to do, but it will never be done as long as Tony Fauci's in office, because he doesn't want us to know, because those are the industries that he has survived by protecting.
Yeah, and then in your book, you cite a statistic that I've just been astonished with, and many of the interviews I've done since I read that, I included and put a plug for your book in, because you say that at the time it was $930 billion with a B that he's been responsible for distributing through the NIAID. I'm sure it's over $1 trillion now. $1 trillion.
Yeah, and the amount of money and. As I said, beginning in 2000, when we had the anthrax attacks, we signed a biological weapons treaty and chemical weapons treaty in 72. So the Pentagon was not allowed to do biological weapons research. But after the anthrax attacks, they wanted to do it very badly, but they didn't want to do it from the Pentagon, because it would look like weapons research. But there was a loophole in the treaty that said if you're doing dual use research, in other words, you're doing research to develop biological weapons, but if they also could be applicable to developing vaccines, then you can do it. So they were reluctant to do it in the Pentagon, but they began funneling all the money to Tony Fauci to do it. And he really became part of the military at that point. And he began doing this bioweapons research, and they gave him a 68% raise because of his authority over the bioweapons research. And because of that, and they give him $1.76 billion a year. And so to hold on to that, a funding stream, to hold on to his salary, he has got to do gain of function. The gain of function has never provided a single scientific or medical development that has assisted us in responding to pandemics, not one. But Fauci continues to do it because it is critical to his salary. And it's critical to that funding stream that he continues to do that, get that funding stream from DARPA, from BARDA, and from the Pentagon.
Well, it would sound like a lot of money, and he is the most highly paid federal employee, I believe, like far ahead of the president.
He gets $437,000 a year. The president, who's the next highest, is $400,000.
Yeah, so he's the highest paid federal employee. But to me, that seems a relatively small amount when you consider the other dollar values involved. And if he's, because there's patents and there's, I mean, when you're distributing $1 trillion, all you need is a small fraction of that. And he's a smart guy. One thing you cannot take away from him, he's an incredible politician. He's really smart and clever. You can certainly question his ethics and integrity, but it seems to me smart enough to figure out how to hide this. So he may be the 400,000 may be a small fraction of what he's really earning every year.
Well, I was not able to find any money that he is getting outside of that. Now he's gotten millions of dollars in awards.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the Israeli government gave him, I think, $1 million. And so he has a lot of other funding streams, but I don't really, I think it's important to understand that most people like that, like him, and even like Gates, they're not really interested in currency. Nobody really cares about how much, cash money you have. They really, people accumulate money because they want power.
Mm-hmm.
And his agency gets the money from the patents. We know he has at least one patent on interferon, and that information is almost impossible to get. But that patent gives him about $150,000 a year. He's claimed for a long time that that he gives that money to charity, but nobody knows what charity he gives it to, and he has never. And of course, the press never asks him anything, and he never says. But what he does is, he's allowed. Let me tell you how important he is to the pharmaceutical industry.
Mm-hmm.
Between 2009 and 2016, there were about 230 drugs approved by FDA, all of which came out of his shop.
No.
And so he is an incubator for pharma. And here's what he does. He has, at his lab, he has Petri dishes filled with every virus: hantavirus, dengue virus, Coxsackie virus, Zika, Ebola, flu, coronavirus. And he has scientists that are messing around with different molecules and different poisons, and they'll drop those poisons into a Petri dish and see if it kills the culture. If it kills the culture, then he has a potential antiviral drug. So the next step is they give it to rats and see if it kills the rats. And if most of the rats survive, now you have a potential antiviral that may work in humans. So then he farms it out to the university. Now the university the person that goes to the university is usually a very powerful person at the university. It's the dean of the medical school, or it's the chair of one of the departments, and they run the clinical trials, which is extremely lucrative. So they will do the phase 1 trial there, and they'll recruit maybe 100 people for the phase 1 trial. Fauci gives that PI, that principal investigator, maybe $20,000 per recruit. The university skims off 50 to 75% of that. So now the university is now hooked into the system. Mm-hmm. Then if it works through phase 1 and phase 2, then they have to bring in big groups of people, 10,000 people, and you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, and they have to bring in a pharmaceutical company and now takes control of about half the patent. Tony Fauci's agency keeps a share of the patent, and they can now collect royalties on Moderna vaccine. They get half the royalties, so they're getting billions of dollars. And the university researcher keeps some of the patents, so he is now permanently attached to Tony Fauci and will do anything what he says. And the university itself is getting some of that patent. So it's hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to these universities every year, in addition to the grants that he's giving. And he can cut all that off if somebody at the university does the wrong study. So, and then it has to go back and go through, once it goes through phase 3, it goes to FDA. And he says, well, those are independent scientists at FDA. The panel is called VRPAC, and they're not people who work for FDA. They're outsiders who are brought in. Well, where are they brought in from? they're Tony Fauci's PIs from all the other universities who are working on his other projects. And they're brought in to rubber stamp whatever drug is coming from Baylor University that week. And they then, okay it and give it a license, because they know that next year their drug is going to be in front of that committee, and they are going to want the committee to rubber stamp that. So that committee never says no. It always greenlights everything, and it's completely controlled by Fauci. He controls the whole process.
And that I just want to, sorry for interrupting, but we just have a classic illustration of what you just shared, in that this week, that very committee 17-0 unanimously approved the COVID jab for 5 to 11-year-olds. And you've written some brilliant articles on it this week. And I thank you for doing it, exposing the truth of this nonsense implementation and approval.
Yeah, and
recommendation for approval.
And if you look at the pedigrees for those people who sit on the committee, you will see that they have conflicts of interest. They're accepting money from the pharmaceutical companies. They're accepting money from, the Congress did one report that said 97% of them are getting money from pharmaceutical companies whose products they are approving. They're getting money from NIH. They're getting money from Gates. And they're completely bought and owned. And they're not independent scientists at all. These are the same people you see on CNN every night. Peter Hotez, Paul Offit, Art Kaplan, Stanley Perlman, all of these people who are supposed to be experts, who are independent experts. They're not independent experts. Every expert you see on CNN is on Tony Fauci's payroll. And CNN will never tell you that. It will say this is an independent virologist, he's an immunologist at Baylor University or Stanford or Harvard, and they're not telling you where that guy's bread is being buttered. And that the person who's buttering it is Tony Fauci with your taxpayer dollars. So the whole system is just fixed. And, people in this country feel there's a certain group of 33% of the people in this country who are very angry. And the reason they're angry is not because they have to wear masks, and it's not even because they have to get vaccines. It's because they feel they're being manipulated. They're being lied to. Their democracy has been subverted, and it's being stolen from them.
So thank you for sharing that. And this, within the last few weeks, there's been your book, you started writing it a while ago, certainly last year. But it's emerging. All these lies are coming out. And there's a significant portion of the alternative media, at least, that's calling for Fauci's resignation because of his lying. He's just caught in all these things, that the lab origin theory that he was promoting, and his double takes, and continually shifting the goalposts. So I'm wondering what your perspective on, because you've done such a deep dive in him. What do you think the likelihood of his being resigning? Is it probably close to impossible?
No, I think it's 100% that he'll resign. I think after my book comes out, what's going to happen is I think for better or for worse, the Republicans are going to take control of the Senate in November, and then you're going to have hearings. And as soon as you have those hearings, he's going to resign, because he cannot survive at this point with everything people know, with all the lies he's been caught in that have caught up with him. He's not going to be able to endure a public hearing. And so I think he's going to become such a liability so quickly. And, all of this stuff that comes out now that probably should not be as significant it is, but it pulls on people's heartstring. And I take back what I said, because and I'm talking about Beaglegate, about him doing terrible sadistic experiments on animals, taking the scalps off of fully formed human fetuses and stitching them to rats so that they get to humanize rats that won't reject them, won't produce antibodies. And so that the fetus scalp begins to grow as the fur of the rat. so that they can test shampoos and see if they make you itch or cause sores or whatever. And then the Beaglegate, where they took in one of these experiments, and there's many, and they did it on monkeys and other animals too, but there are 14 healthy beagle puppies. They bought them, they severed their vocal cords so that the scientists wouldn't have to listen to their agonized barking. And Tony Fauci put $450,000 of US taxpayer money into this experiment. And then they put the beagles for 96 days put a cage over top of their head, or like a netting over top of their head, a box that's filled with carnivorous flies that eat their faces off over 96 days. And then the animal is then euthanized after this, grim and miserable existence that you wouldn't do to any sentient being on the planet. Nobody who was not a sadist in his soul would allow that experiment to happen. And yet Tony Fauci deemed that the best use for $450,000 of US taxpayer money, with all of the screaming needs in public health, all of the people who are suffering, all of the people who are dying, all the people who have no access to health care because they can't afford it. And he made a decision that the best use of that money, and it's not just $450,000, it's millions and millions and millions that he put into these sadistic experiments, was torturing animals to death, like you'd see in a schoolyard with little boys who don't know any better and need to be told, you don't do that to another creature. And Tony Fauci doesn't have that instinct. It's lacking. It's a kind of sociopathy, and we see that. It explains what he's done during COVID, where denying early treatment to millions of Americans who are and forcing them to suffer and die in their homes or on ventilators and remdesivir, which is a deadly toxic drug in hospitals, rather than get treated and be healthy. And and punishing, silencing, censoring, delicensing, discrediting any doctor who tries to say, wait a minute, I've been treating patients and my patients aren't dying because I'm using not just hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, but an entire battery of repurposed drugs that we now know treat virtually all COVID cases. 70 to 90% of COVID deaths and hospitalizations could have been prevented. Yeah. And there are hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed studies that support that. And yet he's saying, he forbids people from doing it. That's really, that is a sociopath.
Yeah, there's no question. So, yeah, and in addition to the drugs, of course, there are nutrients that we know that make big benefit, like vitamin D and zinc.
And during the beginning of the pandemic, he said that. Yeah. Somebody said to him, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm taking vitamin D." But did he ever tell the American public you should be taking vitamin D? Did he ever have this conversation, at fireside chat, saying, "You got to lose weight. The people who are going to die are people who are overweight. You got to get sunlight. You got to go outdoors. You got to minimize stress in your lives, and we have to take care of each other. We have to quarantine people who are sick and show them the best care possible." And no, he had no empathy. And shutting down 1 million businesses, is that really going to save lives? There's no study that indicated it would, and there's certainly no study that indicated it had. As I point out in the book, he had the worst win-loss record of any country in the world. We have 4.2% of the global population, and we had 14.5% of the deaths. Mm-hmm. Why is anybody listening to this guy? There's no health minister in the world who has a worse track record than Tony Fauci. Oh, there are countries in the world, many countries that had 1/100th of our death rate per million in population. And guess what? Those are mainly the African countries and Asian countries that, as a matter of course, are giving ivermectin for river blindness and giving hydroxychloroquine for malaria control.
And they're not obese. They're not obese or eating Westernized foods.
Right.
And they have sun exposure.
Yeah.
So I'm just delighted to hear that you're convinced that he's going to be forced to resign. Could be a good result partially of your book. But problem I see, the decimation he's imposed upon this country with his policies. It's surprising that won't be appreciated, but will likely get him terminated. Is his involvement in this animal research that you just described? That's probably going to be his death key, because people will not tolerate that, and it seems that's you just can't get around that. You can't deny it.
But also, Joe, in my book, as you know, I do a chapter on those animal studies, but in that same chapter, which is called Dr. Fauci, Mr. Hyde,
great title.
I tell a much worse story, which is the experiments that he was doing on Black and Hispanic children.
Yeah.
The experiments, we know at least 85 children died. And what he did is he arranged for the foster care programs in New York and 6 other states to be turned over to the pharmaceutical companies to test his new chemotherapy drugs for AIDS, for HIV. So they were testing, they wanted to test them on children to open a new market, and they wanted to test them on maternal transmission. It couldn't do maternal transmission in this country except for a few Black people in Tennessee and elsewhere. And I tell the story of one of those Black moms who was killed, who probably didn't even have HIV. The children who he was, and then they lied. Fauci's entire staff lied to her and her family for years until an AP reporter got their internal emails and showed that they knew that their drug killed her, and they were denying her compensation and blaming it on the HIV. At the same time, they were doing these studies at Incarnation, a foster home in New York City. And these children had no guardians, so it was illegal studies. To do a clinical trial on children, you need to have a guardian appointed who puts their interests first, ahead of the drug companies. Fauci didn't want that, so he allowed these studies to go forward without a legal guardian for any of these kids. So they had no parent watching out for them. The people who worked in the Incarnation House were not doctors or nurses, so there was no medical professionals. They were mainly Dominican immigrants who were deeply compassionate, who discovered in the middle that they were actually being hired to treat these children as guinea pigs, and they were killing huge numbers of them. Many of the kids didn't even have HIV. So they had no possible benefit from the drug, which is illegal. And Fauci got away with it ultimately. There was a congressional investigation for a brief time, but like everything that gets near him, it kind of peters out. But the record is where many of these children, that BBC did a documentary on these kids back in 2004 called Guinea Pig Kids. And they interview these children who say, a 9-year-old kid or a 12-year-old kid who said, I took the drugs, they made me feel sick, I was vomiting, I couldn't eat, I was tired all the time, it was painful, and I refused to take it. And when you refuse, they sent you down to another of Tony Fauci's PIs at Columbia Presbyterian and had them install a feeding tube to force feed these children these toxic chemotherapy drugs that they refuse to take. And so you have a scene where one little kid is warning, like a 12-year-old is warning a 9-year-old, you got to do it. You got to take them. The kid doesn't want to take it. You got to take it or they'll put in a feeding tube like they did to me. And, those kids, and Celia Farber, who, was really a brilliant researcher on my book, really helped me. But she did an article also where she went up and found the cemetery in Hawthorne, New York, where they were disposing of all the bodies.
Mm.
And it's called Gates of Heaven Cemetery. And there's a big pit with a astroturf carpet on top of it. And inside the pit, when she lifted the carpet, there were hundreds of tiny little coffins just piled haphazardly. And there's a list of all the kids, and there was like maybe 1,000 people on that list. Children don't die. Children, it's very rare for a child to die. And yet this was like an assembly line of death. And she was able to find a number of those, specific names from specific Tony Fauci experiments that were on that monument list there. Anyway, it's a horrific story. It's as bad as Beaglegate is. That what he did to these Black and Hispanic children is even worse. And then the next chapter in my book, which is called White Man's Burden, shows that what he wanted to open another market for these toxic chemotherapy drugs of maternal, showing that women who had AIDS and were pregnant, that he had a drug that would block transmission to their unborn child. You couldn't do those kind of experiments in this country because you're causing by giving, pregnant women the most toxic compounds known to man, compounds that are designed to kill DNA and human cellular structures. It's not a good thing when you give them to pregnant women. And so they went to Africa to do these experiments, and the mayhem and the carnage and the death and the cover-ups and the corruption that they employed that finally came to light, and I show how Fauci, when people should have gone to jail, and how he managed to manipulate President Bush into cooperating with his cover-up. Bush didn't know what he was doing, but Fauci's expert technocratic manipulation of the president, which has come in handy again and again and again to bail him out of these criminal activities.
Yeah, well, I'm just delighted to hear that he's not likely going to continue in this craziness. So after exposing and uncovering and sharing some of the highlights, and believe me, folks, there's much more in this. And if you aren't inspired to read this book from what Bobby just shared, then I don't know, I gotta have second thoughts. But I'm just curious where you would place the biggest sin or evil that he's done. Is it any of the ones you previously described, or another one in the book, or would you place it at what he's done with this pandemic?
Yeah, I think this is the culmination of his career, and he's been building for this. In fact, I have a chapter called Phony Pandemics, where I show he came into the agency in 1968, and in 1976, what had happened with NIH and NIAID and CDC, infectious disease mortality simply stopped happening in our country in the second half of the 20th century because of nutrition, sanitation, hygiene. If people were still getting measles, but it was a rash, it was subclinical, and mumps and chicken pox. And all these diseases that had taken life earlier in history, they simply stopped killing people by the 1960s. And infectious disease became such a low priority that these agencies were really endangered. In fact, in the Reagan administration, they were going to abolish CDC because there was no infectious disease mortalities anymore. And so you had internal discussions where they keep saying, we need a pandemic to scare people. We need a Spanish flu pandemic. And Fauci came in 1968 and 1976. They tried their first fake pandemic. And they ended up making 40 million, administering 40 million vaccines, and they had an epidemic, and the pandemic never materialized. In fact, it was a swine flu pandemic that ended up killing a total globally, the global death of this pandemic. The entire global death rate was one person, a soldier from Fort Dix. That was it. And yet they minted a global panic, and they, put billions of dollars into these companies to develop. That's where they invented liability-free vaccines during that pandemic. That was the first time they ever did it. And then they gave 40 million vaccines. 46 people died, and they said, "Oh my God, we've killed 46 people," and they pulled it.
47 people. 47 people.
Yeah, 40. Now we've killed with this in 1 year 17,000 minimum.
Well, minimum, right?
Minimum. That's a joke, Anthony, because most are never reported. But so then they did it again in 86. Or they did it. They did a fake one. The next fake one they did was the bird flu pandemic in 2006, which was Jeremy Farrar, was a young biologist who now had the Wellcome Trust and was collaborated with Fauci in concealing the gain of function linked to coronavirus. It was the first call that he made after he realized, we probably created coronavirus 19, and we got to hide that. And the first guy he called was the head of Wellcome Trust and Jeremy Farrar for the next 6 weeks. We now call their emails of how he was manipulating the WHO and creating all of these phony articles for the Lancet and Nature, which create and fortify an orthodoxy that says anybody who mentions gain of function studies is a conspiracy theorist. And that held for 2 years. Now it's beginning to break down. He was the guy who he found a duck in Vietnam. He was a biologist in Vietnam, living off of Wellcome Trust money and working with the Chinese. And he found a girl got sick after her duck had died, and then was, for some reason, the duck was unburied. And that story became bird flu. Now, bird flu is really dangerous. Okay, bird flu, when it gets into humans, it can kill 50% of the people it gets into, but it's not transmissible. It's very, very hard to be transmissible. But theoretically, if you ever did have a bird flu that became transmissible, it could be very deadly. So this was the thing they were all waiting for and hoping for. And I sound like I'm being cynical when I say hoping for, but when you read my book, you'll see they were all hoping for it. And so Jeremy Farrar said, "Here it is," and they went crazy. And again, they gave a liability shield to the pharmaceutical industry. They pumped billions of dollars into these new drugs. They forced everybody to take their vaccines, and it turned out to be, I think, maybe 200 or 300 people around the world died of it.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be a fake pandemic.
Yeah, but President Bush projected 2 million deaths, because I wrote a book.
Yeah, that's what Fauci told him, and he mentioned Fauci in his presidential debate. Fauci was running all the show then, and in 2009 they do another swine flu epidemic, and again it turns out to be a complete fraud, utter fraud.
Yeah,
and there's a big scandal because WHO they forced all of these developing nations and European nations to sign sleeper contracts that required them to buy a whole bunch of vaccines from GlaxoSmithKline if WHO ever declared a full-on pandemic. And they changed, just before they declared it, they changed the definition of pandemic so there didn't have to be any deaths. You could have a pandemic that was just a case epidemic with no deaths, nobody dying. And that's what they did. And it turned out to be a huge scandal. Again, the vaccines caused mayhem, caused neurological damage all over the world, and they had to pull them again.
Yeah.
And so and then they did Zika, which was a fake pandemic. Zika never was causing microcephaly. That was just a lie that Tony Fauci invented. They did a big scare with Ebola. And now they've done coronavirus, and they've taken all of the lessons they learned from all the other fake pandemics and rolled it into coronavirus. And I want to make clear, I'm not saying that coronavirus is not a pandemic with it doesn't kill a lot of people. It does, but we've all been manipulated by an exaggeration of cases, the exaggeration of deaths, the obscuring of the data, all of the manipulations that they've done to us, which everybody who listens to this show already knows about. But at the end of that chapter, I have a picture that somebody got from a Freedom of Information request, and it is a March Madness graph of all of the different pandemics that he had, fake pandemics he's tried during his career, all converging with the grand winner being coronavirus. And he signed it. Somebody on his staff made it. But it's Tony Fauci's triumph winning March Madness. And, it shows what it is basically a picture of his career, him trying every 3 or 4 years a new fake pandemic and finally hitting on all 8 cylinders with coronavirus. And, it's like, it's a joke. And that's the punchline. And, we are the punchline.
Well, I can't thank you enough for doing the hard work. And I want to emphasize that word, hard and diligent work and discipline that it took to commit to the many hours. I mean, I know personally, you've had to cancel some meetings that we had because you have the book deadlines. So it's there. It's a wonderful book. Now, I want to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of this because there's a threat. The threat is, you read about it on my site before. Elizabeth Warren issued a letter to the CEO of Amazon to ban my book, to burn my book, The Truth About COVID-19, and along with several other congressmen. So she may do the same thing for this book. I mean, that's her, but hopefully she won't, because this week, you and I and my publisher, Chelsea Green, filed a lawsuit against Elizabeth Warren for an injunction to prevent her from doing this in the future. So she will not impact your book. Maybe
there's actually really good case law on this. We all, I have this case against Facebook, and the law in this country says that under the First Amendment, Facebook has absolute right to censor. So Facebook's a private, essentially a printing press. And they can put what they want on, and they can invite their own guests, and they can exclude guests, and they don't have to give any reason. But when the government tells them to censor, then it becomes illegal. And that's called the state actor theory, because a private company can censor you, but the government cannot. And if it appears that the government is censoring you, that's illegal. And so I'm suing Facebook on that issue. And we're in the Ninth Circuit now, but we're going to go to I'm sure that we'll end up in the Supreme Court if they grant us cert. But this other issue, I think the case law, our case that Joe and I have against Elizabeth Warren is even stronger, because here is a powerful public official who is ordering a private corporation that is largely dependent on federal regulatory policies and federal largesse to censor people who disagree with her political position. And that's why we had the revolution. And against England, we said, the king should not be able to silence people, and his ministers should not be able to silence people, and members of parliament should not be able to silence their political opponent. I think, Elizabeth Warren's position on this is really frightening, because I don't even understand how a liberal Democrat, the Democratic Party that I grew up in is a party that for which free speech was sanctified. The ACLU went and defended the Nazis when they marched into Skokie, and I defended them. And what they're saying is repulsive to me, but I need to live and die for their right to speak, for their right to say it. That's how we live in our country. Our country is our democracy.
That's how we used to live.
It's dependent on the free flow of information. And when you have an important Democrat, I want to ask Elizabeth Warren, do you believe in democracy anymore? Because she clearly does not have faith in the people of the United States to be able to make up their minds about or to critically think about decisions. She thinks that they need to be manipulated. They need to be protected from information that she considers dangerous. And it evinces a complete failure of faith in the demos, in the people, in democracy. And, there's a lot of troubling things that have come out of our new reliance on these social media platforms in our country, and democracies around the world need to struggle to figure out how to deal with that. But censorship is not the answer, and she ought to know better. And the fact that there's many people in my party who believe that censorship is okay, 78% now, shows that my party has lost touch, lost faith in democracy. It's hard to call yourself the Democratic Party when you don't believe in democracy anymore, when you don't believe in the people.
Yeah. So have you changed it's a really interesting commentary on the party. So are you considering switching parties or?
I still have faith in many of these people that, the people who are in the Democratic Party are driven by fear, and fear has overcome their capacity for critical thought. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we can abandon them as Americans, and I'm not going to abandon them. I think my job is to try to bring them back around, and try to be a bridge between people of goodwill all over this country who believe in their heart in the values of American democracy. And I try not to be political in what I say, because I think politics, it polarizes us. I think the elites want us fighting each other. They want us polarized. They want us labeling each other. And I think what we all need to do is to reach out to people who are our friends, people who are our acquaintances, people who are misguided, and begin recruiting them back into democracy.
That's a great recommendation. I'm wondering, I know we're close to the end, if you have any final recommendation as to what you would advise to address this whole issue, because it's probably the most significant issue we've ever faced in our life.
Here's what I'd say, Joe. Two thoughts. One is that we're now at a critical point where they're about to poison 26 million children with
tens of thousands of dead children.
During the clinical trials, 20 people died in the vaccine group and only 14 in the control group. So according to Pfizer's own data, if you take the vaccine, you're 48% more likely to die. You're going to die, less likely to die of COVID, but 4 times more likely to die of a heart attack. So for every life they saved from COVID, they killed.
And that wasn't the child death either. That was
the child was even worse, because there's only 1,300 kids in that cohort, and we know that one of them was Jennifer Gary, and Jennifer Gary got seizures. She is permanently paralyzed, and she is living off a feeding tube. And Pfizer reported her injuries as a stomach ache. They were lying. Now, if 1 out of every 1,300 kids is paralyzed in the clinical trial, you can project that out and say, when there's 26 million, this 26 million kids, you're going to have tens of thousands of people who are going to suffer those kind of injuries. So giving this is foolhardy, reckless. It's sociopath. Here's what I would say to people: we have to stop this. And this is the hill where we all have to die on. We cannot let them give it. If you are a parent, and you let them give this to your child, you are not doing your job. If you're a doctor, you're committing malpractice to give this to a child. We all need to resist. I would say that every American who sees what's happening has to now start engaging in civil disobedience every day. And that may mean, going to a store and telling them if they demand a vaccine passport that you're not going to patronize that store anymore. It may mean resisting on the job. And, do not quit. Do not quit. Make them fire you, because then you have lost it. And make them fire you. Right now, the best thing to make them fire you for is trying to take an emergency use authorization vaccine, because there are no approved vaccines in this country available to any American. It was a myth. It was a hoax. It was a chicanery for them to say, oh, we approve this Comirnaty vaccine. If you go on Pfizer's website, they will tell you, we do not make Comirnaty available in the United States. Why are they trying to go after our kids? Here's why. The vaccines can only get liability protection once they are approved. The only way they get liability protection is if you're on the child's vaccination schedule. So, and then once the CDC votes them on the child vaccination schedule, they get liability protection even for adults. So they need to put them on that child schedule so that they can start selling them in this country, because they're not going to sell them until they get liability protection. Because of course you wouldn't. I would one lawsuit, I bankrupt that company if they didn't have liability protection. So that's why they're going after our kids. They need it to get that liability protection, and we need to stop them from that collateral damage that they're going to cause to an entire generation of children. 26 million children on a vaccine that's been tested on 1,300 kids with catastrophic results. The other thing I would say, and this is in line with what I was talking about with you earlier about how do you persuade people, to open their eyes to what's happening? How do you wake them up?
Mm-hmm. That's the question.
I talked to a friend of mine who was a really brilliant psychologist and social psychologist the other day, and he said, the worst thing that you can do with somebody who is, part of the orthodoxy is to try to persuade them directly. If you run at them and challenge their beliefs and ridicule them, you're not going to get anywhere. But there is a way to get them to open their eyes, and that's with the Socratic method, which is to ask them questions about their belief, to ask them, to challenge them gently with questions, to ask them, if the vaccine doesn't prevent transmission, how can we justify mandating? How do we think it can end the pandemic? If the vaccine's only tested on 1,300 children, is it right to give it to 26 million? Is it right to give it the Lancet studies as that not a single child anywhere in the globe, a healthy child, has ever died from COVID-19? There are children who died, but they all have these, really heavy-duty comorbidities, very overweight, diabetes, asthma, etc. How do we justify giving this healthy child when they have no risk from COVID, and yet they do have a profound risk from the vaccine? Is that okay? And to ask people questions rather than challenge them directly. So that's one of the things I'm trying, and something that your listeners may try as well.
Okay, well, that's really sage advice. I can't thank you enough for your dedication, your commitment, and your putting together this book as a resource. Again, I strongly recommend it. It's clearly, you definitely set the standard at this point. And my book was a good primer, but it was literally 1/6 the size of your book. And you've got a lot more work went into it to document this. And hopefully it will be the catalyst to have Fauci resign at some point in the near future. So thank you for everything you've done. And actually, I should mention that you've got an unbelievably great website. I subscribe to it every day. Put out so many good articles. It's the Defender.
.com. The Defender. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah. So it's a great site. It's
thank you for everything that you do. You've been doing this for a lifetime, and you've been fighting back courageously. And they're really trying to destroy you now. And really proud to be your friend and to be in the trenches with you.
Yeah, well, likewise. It's a team effort, and it's definitely, I firmly believe that ultimately we win in the end, but there's going to be a lot of challenges, and it's probably likely going to get worse before, especially with this. It's hard to go to sleep at night just knowing they passed that and what's likely going to happen. I just don't see any intervention, and so many children are going to die and suffer needlessly because of this. But it is what it is, and we've got to go forward. And I really thank you for compiling the data and giving us a strategy that we can make a difference. So thanks for everything.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks so much for watching. Remember, hit the like and subscribe button so you can get more videos that can help you and your family take control of your health.